The first rays of dawn on July 14, 1822, painted Charleston's cobblestone streets in golden hues as the city's enslaved population prepared for what appeared to be another ordinary Sunday morning. In the slave quarters scattered throughout the holy city, hundreds of men and women dressed in their finest clothing, preparing to attend the various churches that dotted the peninsula. But beneath the facade of Christian devotion, something far more dangerous was stirring. Denmark Vesey, a free black carpenter who had purchased his liberty with lottery winnings 23 years earlier, moved quietly through the pre-dawn darkness toward the African Methodist Episcopal Church on Hampstead Road. At 55 years old, Vesey possessed the respect of both enslaved and free blacks throughout Charleston, his literacy and business success making him a natural leader in a community starved for representation. The date had been chosen with deliberate symbolism, Bastille Day, marking the anniversary of the French Revolution that had ultimately led to the abolition of slavery in Haiti. Vesey and his inner circle understood the psychological power of this connection, drawing inspiration from Toussaint Louverture's successful revolution that had established the first free black republic in the Western Hemisphere. What you're about to witness changed the course of American slavery forever. Make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell. The events of this Sunday morning will shock you to your core. As Charleston's church bells began their morning call to worship, Vesey's most trusted lieutenants were already in position throughout the city. Peter Poyas, a skilled ship carpenter who could read and write, had spent the night ensuring that weapons were properly distributed among the dock workers who formed the backbone of their revolutionary force. His intimate knowledge of Charleston's harbor would prove crucial in the hours to come. Monday Gell, an African-born Igbo who worked as a harness maker, had used his mobility between plantations to coordinate with enslaved people throughout the surrounding countryside. For months, he had carried coded messages and recruitment letters, building a network that now extended 30 miles beyond Charleston's borders. Rolla Bennett, the trusted manservant of Governor Thomas Bennett himself, possessed perhaps the most dangerous assignment of all. His access to the governor's mansion and intimate knowledge of the white political establishment made him invaluable to Vesey's plans, but also placed him at enormous personal risk. Gullah Jack Pritchard, an East African priest who had been purchased in Zingbar 16 years earlier, brought spiritual authority that resonated deeply with Charleston's African-born population. His knowledge of traditional religious practices and his reputation as a conjurer gave him influence that transcended the boundaries between plantation and city. The conspiracy that was about to unfold represented 2 years of meticulous planning, beginning in late 1820 when Vesey had first shared his vision with his most trusted allies from the African Methodist Episcopal Church. The temporary closure of their church by white authorities in 1818, and the arrest of 140 congregants, had provided the final motivation needed to transform simmering resentment into organized revolution. As the morning progressed and Charleston's white families prepared for Sunday services, none suspected that their most trusted house servants, their skilled artisans, and their field hands had spent months preparing for this day. The psychological advantage was entirely with the conspirators. White Charleston had grown comfortable with the illusion of black submission, never imagining that their slaves had been planning their destruction. At 8 o'clock on the morning of July 14, 1822, Charleston's churches filled with the familiar sounds of Sunday worship as white families gathered for morning services, their enslaved servants dutifully attending to ensure their master's comfort. The irony was profound. While white Charleston prayed for divine blessing on their way of life, their slaves prepared to answer their own prayers for liberation through violence. The African Methodist Episcopal Church on Hampstead Road had become the epicenter of the conspiracy, its congregation of over 3,000 members providing both cover and recruitment opportunities for Vesey's revolutionary network. The church's emphasis on biblical stories of liberation, particularly the Exodus narrative of enslaved Hebrews escaping from Egypt, had provided theological justification for what was about to unfold. Denmark Vesey stood among his fellow congregants, his weathered hands holding a Bible as he sang hymns of liberation that carried double meanings for those who understood the plan. Go Down Moses took on special significance as the spiritual became a call to arms, each verse reminding the conspirators that God had freed enslaved people before and would do so again. The spiritual warfare was about to become physical. Don't forget to like this video as we witness how faith and resistance merged into deadly action. Throughout Charleston's white churches, enslaved house servants who had been trusted with their masters' lives for years sat quietly in designated sections, their outward demeanor giving no hint of the violence they were prepared to unleash. Sarah, a cook who had served the Drayton family for 15 years, kept her eyes fixed on her prayer book while mentally reviewing her assignment to eliminate the overseer who had whipped her son the previous month. At St. Philip's Episcopal Church, where Charleston's wealthiest planters worshipped Caesar, a carriage driver who transported his master to and from services every Sunday, sat in the slave gallery calculating the exact moment when he would signal his fellow conspirators to begin their assault. His intimate knowledge of the church's layout and the habits of its white congregation made him invaluable to the coordinated attack that was planned. The plantation chapels throughout the Charleston district witnessed similar scenes of deceptive worship as enslaved congregants who had received word of the uprising prepared for their roles in the liberation campaign. Field hands who normally labored 7 days a week had been granted permission to attend Sunday services, providing perfect cover for the largest gathering of potential revolutionaries in Charleston's history. As morning services concluded around 10 o'clock, the conspirators began moving toward their assigned positions with military precision. Years of careful planning had resulted in a sophisticated network of communication that allowed coordination between urban slaves, plantation workers, and free blacks throughout the region. The moment of truth was approaching as Charleston's white population remained blissfully unaware that their most trusted servants had been preparing for months to claim their freedom through organized violence. The psychological advantage belonged entirely to the enslaved, who had spent years observing their masters' routines and vulnerabilities while appearing to be nothing more than obedient property. Peter Poyas had positioned his men near the Meeting Street Arsenal, where Charleston's military weapons were stored. His experience as a ship carpenter had given him knowledge of engineering and fortification that would prove crucial in breaching the arsenal's defenses. The successful capture of these weapons would transform the uprising from a desperate rebellion into a properly equipped military campaign. As the church bells of Charleston finished their morning call to worship, they were unknowingly tolling the end of an era. Within hours, the carefully maintained facade of racial harmony that had characterized antebellum Charleston would be shattered forever, replaced by a reality that white South Carolinians had always feared but never truly believed possible. At exactly 11:30 on Sunday morning, July 14, 1822, as Charleston's white families enjoyed the peaceful aftermath of morning worship, the signal that would launch America's most coordinated slave uprising echoed across the city. The sound of the African drum, traditionally used for celebration, now carried a message of revolution as Denmark VC's conspirators simultaneously struck at targets throughout Charleston and the surrounding plantations. The first blood was spilled at the Drayton Plantation, 6 miles northeast of the city, where field hands led by a man known only as Bacchus surrounded the overseer's quarters during the traditional Sunday afternoon prayer meeting. James Morrison, the plantation's head driver who had earned the hatred of every enslaved person under his supervision, was leading a group of house servants in evening prayers when the attack began. The violence was swift and merciless. Bacchus and his men burst through the doors of the overseer's house carrying machetes, axes, and clubs fashioned from plantation tools. Morrison's screams of terror were cut short as multiple blades found their target, his blood spattering across the walls of the room where he had forced enslaved people to pray for patience and obedience just moments before. This was just the beginning of a coordinated assault that would shake the foundations of American slavery. Make sure you're subscribed to witness how enslaved people claimed their freedom through organized resistance. At the Ravenel Plantation on the Ashley River, Monday Gell led a group of 20 enslaved men in a similarly brutal assault on the plantation's management structure. The overseer, William Thompson, was killed alongside 2 assistant drivers who had earned reputations for particular cruelty toward the enslaved workforce. Their deaths were not random acts of violence but calculated eliminations of the white power structure that maintained plantation discipline. The coordination of these simultaneous attacks revealed the sophisticated nature of VC's planning. Using a network of communication that had been developed over months of careful preparation, the conspirators struck at multiple targets within minutes of each other, preventing any single plantation from warning others of the approaching danger. In Charleston itself, Peter Poyas led his carefully selected team of dock workers and artisans in an assault on the Meeting Street Arsenal. Their intimate knowledge of the building's layout, gained through years of working in the area, allowed them to overwhelm the single guard and gain access to the weapons that would transform their rebellion into a proper military campaign. The psychological impact of these coordinated attacks cannot be overstated. For the first time in the history of American slavery, enslaved people had demonstrated the ability to organize sophisticated military operations that struck simultaneously across a wide geographic area. The myth of black passivity and white invincibility was shattered forever in those first moments of violence. Rolla Bennett's assignment at the governor's mansion represented, perhaps the most audacious aspect of the entire conspiracy. Using his position as a trusted house servant, he gained access to Governor Thomas Bennett's private study where the state's senior political leadership often gathered for informal discussions. The governor's death would eliminate the highest-ranking official in South Carolina while demonstrating that no white person, regardless of their position or power, was safe from revolutionary justice. As news of the attacks spread through Charleston slave quarters, hundreds of enslaved people who had been waiting for this moment abandoned their Sunday afternoon duties and rushed to join the growing army of liberation. The sound of drums and gunfire announced to every black person in the city that the long-awaited day of freedom had finally arrived. The speed and coordination of these initial attacks left Charleston's white population completely unprepared for the scale of the violence that was unfolding. The comfortable assumption that their slaves were content and loyal was replaced by the terrifying reality that they had been living alongside people who had spent months planning their destruction. By noon on July 14, 1822, the sound of violence had spread throughout the Charleston district as coordinated attacks erupted on plantations from the Ashley River to the Santee Delta. What had begun as carefully planned assassinations of overseers and drivers had evolved into a full-scale uprising that threatened to destroy the entire foundation of South Carolina's slave-based economy. At the Middleton plantation on the Ashley River, a group of field hands led by a man called Neptune had cornered the plantation's 3 white overseers in the main house during their traditional Sunday afternoon meal. The overseers, armed only with whips and their assumed authority over black bodies, found themselves facing 20 determined men carrying the same tools they had been forced to use in the rice fields, now turned into weapons of liberation. The violence that followed was both brutal and symbolic. Thomas Whitmore, the head overseer who had ordered countless whippings and brandings during his 5-year tenure, was hacked to death with the same rice hooks that enslaved people used to harvest their master's wealth. His assistant overseers suffered similar fates as years of accumulated rage and humiliation were unleashed in a few moments of revolutionary justice. The uprising was spreading faster than anyone had imagined possible. Hit that like button as we witness how enslaved people turned their agricultural tools into weapons of war. On the Cooper River, at what was known as the German settlement, enslaved people who had been forced to work in the brutal conditions of indigo cultivation launched their own coordinated assault on the plantation management structure. The overseer's house, where punishments were planned and whippings were ordered, became the site of a fierce battle as enslaved men and women fought to eliminate those who had made their lives miserable. The strategic nature of these attacks became clear as the day progressed. Rather than engaging in random violence against all whites, the conspirators focused their efforts on eliminating the overseers, drivers, and other enforcement personnel who maintained day-to-day control over the enslaved population. This selective targeting demonstrated sophisticated political understanding of how the slave system actually functioned. In Charleston itself, word of the plantation attacks had reached the urban enslaved population, triggering a coordinated response that had been planned for months. House servants throughout the city abandoned their posts, joining with dock workers, artisans, and laborers to form an army that quickly gained control of several key neighborhoods. Gullah Jack Pritchard's spiritual authority proved crucial in maintaining morale and discipline among the urban rebels. Drawing upon African religious traditions that had survived the Middle Passage, he conducted ceremonies that transformed ordinary enslaved people into warriors fighting for their freedom. His reputation as a conjurer gave him influence that transcended tribal and linguistic differences within Charleston's diverse African population. The rebels' capture of the Meeting Street arsenal had provided them with muskets, pistols, powder, and shot that transformed their capabilities dramatically. No longer dependent on improvised weapons, they could engage white militiamen on relatively equal terms while maintaining the psychological advantage of fighting for their freedom rather than their oppression. As afternoon turned toward evening, the rebels controlled significant portions of Charleston and had eliminated white authority on at least a dozen plantations throughout the surrounding countryside. The sound of gunfire and the smoke rising from burning buildings announced to everyone in the region that the impossible was happening. Enslaved people had successfully organized a military campaign that threatened to overthrow white supremacy in South Carolina. The coordination and discipline displayed by the rebels revealed the extent of Denmark VC's planning and the military knowledge that many participants had brought from their experiences in Africa. This wasn't a spontaneous uprising driven by desperation. It was a carefully planned revolution executed by people who understood both the weaknesses of their oppressors and the requirements for successful military action. As the sun reached its zenith on July 14, 1822, Charleston's white population faced the reality that their worst nightmare was unfolding before their eyes. Reports of coordinated attacks throughout the plantation district, combined with the sound of gunfire from their own city streets, created a panic that paralyzed the normal mechanisms of white authority. Governor Thomas Bennett, who had survived Rolla Bennett's assassination attempt only by chance, found himself trapped in his mansion as armed enslaved people controlled the streets outside. The irony of his situation was not lost on anyone. The most powerful white man in South Carolina was now a prisoner in his own home, dependent on the mercy of people he had considered property just hours before. The Charleston City Guard, composed primarily of young white men who had never faced serious opposition from enslaved people, found themselves overwhelmed by the scale and coordination of the uprising. Their assumptions about black military capabilities were shattered as they encountered rebels who fought with discipline and tactical knowledge that exceeded their own. The tables had completely turned in Charleston as enslaved people claimed control of their own city. Don't forget to share this video to help preserve this incredible story of resistance and revolution. At the Charleston harbor, Peter Poyas and his men had successfully captured several ships that would serve as escape routes if the rebellion ultimately failed. Their knowledge of seamanship, gained through years of working the docks, allowed them to prepare vessels for the journey to Haiti that had always been part of VC's contingency planning. The psychological impact of the uprising extended far beyond Charleston itself. News of successful slave resistance spread throughout the South via the same networks that had been used to plan the rebellion, inspiring enslaved people in Georgia, North Carolina, and Virginia while striking terror into the hearts of white plantation owners throughout the region. Monday Gel's coordination with enslaved people on plantations throughout the Lowcountry had created a domino effect of resistance that exceeded even Denmark VC's most optimistic projections. Plantation after plantation reported the deaths of overseers and the disappearance of their enslaved workforce, creating a regional crisis that threatened the economic foundation of the entire area. The rebels' treatment of captured whites revealed their understanding that this was a war for liberation rather than a campaign of revenge. Unlike later slave uprisings that would result in indiscriminate killing, VC's followers demonstrated remarkable restraint, focusing their violence on those who had been directly responsible for maintaining the slave system. By late afternoon, the rebels controlled most of Charleston's peninsula and had established communication with revolutionary forces on plantations throughout a 30-mile radius. The speed and effectiveness of their coordination demonstrated capabilities that white South Carolinians had never imagined their enslaved population possessed. The economic implications of the uprising were immediately apparent as the rice and cotton that formed the foundation of South Carolina's wealth lay abandoned in fields throughout the region. The enslaved people who had created this wealth through their labor had chosen freedom over continued production, striking at the heart of the system that had made white Charleston one of the wealthiest cities in America. Denmark VC's vision of a coordinated uprising that would force white authorities to negotiate rather than simply suppress had been realized beyond his wildest dreams. The rebels now possessed sufficient military strength and territorial control to demand recognition as a legitimate force rather than merely rebellious property. As evening approached on July 14, 1822, the success of the Charleston uprising had created a new reality in which enslaved people had demonstrated their capacity for sophisticated military organization and their willingness to fight and die for freedom. The comfortable assumptions that had allowed slavery to flourish in South Carolina had been permanently shattered. As darkness fell over Charleston on July 14, 1822, Denmark VC found himself in a position that no enslaved person in American history had ever occupied, leading a successful military force that controlled a major American city and held the power to negotiate the terms of freedom for thousands of his fellow African Americans. From his position in the captured Meeting Street arsenal, VC surveyed a city transformed by revolutionary violence. The streets that had once echoed with the sounds of slave auctions and white authority now rang with the voices of free men and women celebrating their liberation. Smoke rose from the mansions of prominent slaveholders, while armed black men patrolled neighborhoods that had been exclusively white just 12 hours earlier. The success of the uprising had created an unprecedented situation that neither side had fully anticipated. VC understood that maintaining control of Charleston would require more than military force. It would demand diplomatic skill and political sophistication that could transform a successful rebellion into lasting freedom. This moment would determine whether the rebellion became a temporary victory or permanent revolution. Make sure you're subscribed to see how VC navigated the most crucial hours of the uprising. Messages had already been dispatched to contacts in Haiti, where the successful revolution led by Toussaint Louverture had created the world's first free black republic. VC's correspondence with Haitian officials over the previous months had established the framework for potential support, including ships and supplies that could sustain a prolonged resistance campaign. The capture of Governor Bennett had provided the rebels with a valuable bargaining chip, but it had also created a diplomatic dilemma. Killing the governor would certainly send a powerful message about black determination, but it would also eliminate any possibility of negotiating a peaceful resolution that could preserve the lives of the thousands of enslaved people who had joined the uprising. Peter Poyas reported that his men had successfully prepared several ships in Charleston harbor for immediate departure, while also establishing defensive positions that could hold the city against counterattack for several days. The rebels' control of the harbor gave them both an escape route and the ability to prevent reinforcements from arriving by sea. Throughout the city, former slaves were experiencing freedom for the first time in their lives, and their joy was infectious. Children who had never known anything but bondage played freely in streets where they had previously been forbidden to walk without passes. Women who had endured years of sexual abuse from their masters now carried weapons and spoke of justice rather than submission. The psychological transformation was as significant as the military victory. Men and women who had been conditioned to view themselves as property were now making decisions about war and peace, life and death, freedom and captivity. The rebellion had not just changed their circumstances, it had restored their humanity. Monday Gell's reports from the countryside painted a picture of widespread success as plantation after plantation fell under rebel control. The elimination of overseers and drivers had effectively paralyzed the enforcement mechanisms that maintained slave discipline throughout the region. As the night progressed, scouts brought word that military forces from Savannah and Columbia were already marching toward Charleston, while naval vessels from the federal government were approaching the harbor. The window of opportunity for negotiation was closing rapidly as white authorities prepared to retake the city through overwhelming force. VC gathered his inner circle to consider their options. They could attempt to hold Charleston against superior forces, accepting the likelihood of eventual defeat but demonstrating that enslaved people could fight as effectively as their oppressors. Alternatively, they could execute their planned escape to Haiti, preserving their leadership for future rebellions while abandoning thousands of followers to certain punishment. The decision that VC and his lieutenants made in those crucial hours would determine not just their own fate, but the future of slavery throughout the American South. They had already achieved something unprecedented: the successful organization and execution of a coordinated slave uprising that had taken control of a major American city. The question now was whether they could transform that military success into lasting political change. The dawn of July 15, 1822, revealed a Charleston forever changed by 24 hours of revolutionary violence. As federal troops and state militias converged on the city from all directions, Denmark Vesey made the decision that would define his legacy and the future of slave resistance in America. He chose to fight rather than flee, understanding that the psychological impact of black military resistance would resonate throughout the South regardless of the ultimate outcome. The final battle for Charleston began at sunrise as approximately 800 well-equipped federal troops and militia forces launched a coordinated assault on rebel positions throughout the city. The rebels, numbering nearly 1,000 but possessing limited ammunition and weapons, prepared to defend the freedom they had claimed through violence the previous day. Peter Poyas led the defense of the Meeting Street Arsenal, understanding that the rebels' ability to maintain their weapons depot would determine their capacity for sustained resistance. His men, most of whom had never engaged in formal military combat, fought with the desperation of people who knew that capture meant certain death and the courage of those who had tasted freedom and refused to surrender it. The final battle would determine whether this rebellion inspired future resistance or served as a warning against challenging white supremacy. Hit that notification bell to ensure you never miss these crucial moments of American history. The urban combat that erupted throughout Charleston streets was unlike anything the city had ever witnessed. Former slaves who had built the city's houses and worked its docks now used their intimate knowledge of the terrain to conduct guerrilla warfare against professional soldiers. Every alley and building became a potential fortress as the rebels fought building by building to maintain their revolutionary gains. Gullah Jack Pritchard's spiritual leadership proved crucial in maintaining rebel morale during the desperate fighting. His African religious practices, combined with Christian liberation theology, created a powerful motivation that sustained resistance even as federal artillery began demolishing rebel positions. The harbor battle demonstrated the rebels' sophisticated planning as they used captured ships to prevent federal naval vessels from landing reinforcements. For several hours, former slaves who had loaded and unloaded cargo for years commanded armed vessels in combat against the United States Navy. As the day progressed and federal forces gradually overwhelmed rebel positions, Denmark Vesey made his final strategic decision. Rather than surrendering and facing inevitable execution, he chose to lead a final assault on the governor's mansion, seeking to eliminate the symbol of white authority in South Carolina even as his revolution collapsed around him. The assault on the governor's mansion became the rebellion's last stand as Vesey and approximately 50 of his most devoted followers fought their way through federal troops to reach their final objective. The battle was brief but intense, as revolutionaries who had nothing left to lose faced soldiers fighting to preserve the social order that defined their world. Denmark Vesey died as he had lived during those crucial 48 hours, as a free man fighting for the liberation of his people. His death, along with those of Peter Poyas, Monday Gell, Gullah Jack Pritchard, and dozens of other rebels, ended the most successful slave uprising in American history, but established a legacy that would inspire resistance for generations to come. The aftermath of the Charleston uprising transformed slavery throughout the American South as white authorities implemented new restrictions designed to prevent future rebellions. The success of VC's coordination terrified slaveholders throughout the region, leading to laws that prohibited enslaved people from learning to read, gathering in groups, or traveling between plantations without passes. Yet the rebellion's impact extended far beyond the immediate repression that followed. Word of the uprising spread throughout the enslaved communities of the South via the same networks that had made the rebellion possible, inspiring countless acts of individual and collective resistance over the decades that followed. The economic disruption caused by the uprising demonstrated the vulnerability of the slave-based economy to organized resistance. The rice and cotton crops that formed the foundation of Southern wealth lay rotting in fields throughout the Lowcountry, while the enslaved people who had created that wealth had proven their willingness to destroy it in pursuit of freedom. The courage of Denmark Vesey and his followers changed the course of American history, proving that enslaved people would fight and die for freedom when given the opportunity. Subscribe to this channel and share this video to ensure their sacrifice is never forgotten. Their blood watered the seeds of liberation that would eventually grow into the broader movement for human rights in America. Though their revolution was ultimately crushed, their legacy lives on in every person who refuses to accept injustice and oppression. The rebels' cry for freedom echoes through the centuries, challenging each generation to expand the boundaries of human dignity and to remember that the price of liberty is often paid in blood by those who have the courage to claim it.